If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. I'm Kathryn, your host, and I'm happy to be here with you for another show. This episode has a bit of an odd title. I'm calling it Emotional Not Eating. And this is in contrast to emotional eating, which I've talked about a lot on the podcast, and it's something I discuss in my course and that Coach Julie works on in the Brain Over Binge group. And I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast do have some emotional eating patterns in that your brain tends to drive you toward food in times that you're emotional. And this doesn't have to be binge eating. Binge eating can also get linked to emotions over time through those connections of habit and through patterns maybe you learned from childhood, but binge eating and emotional eating are not the same thing. Emotional eating can be a bit of a nuanced topic because we're always experiencing emotions. Like as we go about our life, we have different emotions running through us, and we also have to eat. So sometimes it can be hard to distinguish what is actual emotional eating or what is just eating in times that you are emotional. Typically, someone who struggles with emotional eating, it is a noticeable pattern. It's something that interferes with their life. They feel these intrusive urges to eat in times of loneliness or stress or sadness or any other difficult emotion. There is definitely a habitual element to this, but there can also be some physiological processes behind this, and also just the fact that our brain tends to be more reward-seeking or pleasure-seeking in times that we are in pain or in times that we are struggling with some negative elements in our life. It's natural for our brain to drive us toward some pleasure during this time, and food is a form of pleasure. But interestingly enough, the exact opposite can be true as well, in that some people, when they are emotional or stressed or sad, their brain drives them to not eat. They experience a decrease in appetite and a decrease in desire for food. Now, you may be someone who experiences both. Sometimes during certain emotions, you may have an increased appetite and an increased desire for food. And in other emotional situations, you may find that your appetite kind of shuts down. There are also physiological explanations for this decrease in appetite. Most of the reason is based in our fight or flight response, in that our body is trying to help us survive in times of stress, and it can shut down our digestion and our appetite because our brain thinks we have a more immediate survival need. There's some research that suggests that more acute stressors tend to decrease the appetite and long-term stressors can tend to increase the appetite. But everyone is a little bit different in how they experience appetite fluctuations during stressful times. Because I've already talked about emotional eating a lot on this podcast in the past, and also on my blog and in my books, I'm going to link to some of those resources in the show notes. So if you are someone who struggles with emotional eating, I definitely encourage you to check out those resources. Through the rest of this episode, I'm going to be focusing more on the emotional not eating. And the idea for this topic came about through a personal experience I've had recently with this emotional not eating, or this decrease in appetite during stressful times. In an episode earlier this year, I talked about how sometimes I'll see things out in the world or I'll experience things in my own life, and it really gives me insights that I want to come share with you on the podcast. And I really wanted to commit to doing that more this year. And I have not done it as much as I would have liked to, and ironically, or maybe fittingly, the topic of today will kind of explain that. I've had to put some of my goals for Brain Over Binge on the side a little bit to focus on some personal challenges I've dealt with myself and my children. I know so many of you can relate to just life being hard sometimes. It just is. And then unrelated to those other challenges, A little over a month ago, I experienced a very difficult and heart-wrenching breakup, and I know all of us have been there, and I know I'm going to come through okay, but what was really surprising and what I want to talk about here to hopefully give you some insights is that right around that emotional upheaval of the breakup, my appetite just completely shut down. And I've had decreases in appetite throughout my life from time to time, but this was different than anything I've experienced before. It was very sustained. It was day after day, week after week of just food not being appealing and not wanting to eat. And I definitely still ate during this time of having a lack of appetite. And of course, that's what I want to encourage you to do as well. I'm someone who does enjoy food. I like to eat. And I talk about on the podcast that that's perfectly normal. That's part of being human. And just to wake up every day and not want to eat and to sit down in front of a plate of food and to feel like it's a chore to have to eat it was just very different for me. Now, the first several days of just that extreme, intense emotion, I definitely ate less. But after the first few days passed and my appetite still didn't come back, I realized, okay, I can't really trust my appetite here in this situation. I need to use more of that rational brain power to eat what I know is a nourishing, adequate quantity of food for me, even if I don't feel like it. And this is the first place I want to stop and point out some insights that I hope will be useful for you, is that there may be times when you experience this emotional not eating. And it's okay. Like, it's okay if you skip a meal. It's okay if you eat a little less during a day when you're experiencing extreme emotions. Like, it's going to happen in your life. It's the same with emotional eating in that I don't think it's realistic to expect ourselves never to eat in a way that's driven more by emotions. It may happen from time to time, and that's okay. And the emotional not eating may happen from time to time. But the key is to catch it before it goes too far, to realize, hey, my appetite is not quite reliable here. Just like if you have an extreme appetite in times of emotions, you can recognize that and not follow it. If you have a very low appetite during times of emotions, you can recognize that and not follow it. The solution to an emotionally driven decrease in appetite is not to just give up and not eat. Just like the solution to an emotionally driven increase in appetite is not just to give up and binge. If you do find yourself eating in a way that feels only driven by emotions and not by hunger at all, it's important to know that you're still capable of stopping at a reasonable amount and also learning to make a different choice next time you're in that emotional situation. And it's the same with the emotional not eating. It's okay if you find yourself maybe eating a little less, but it's really important to know that you're capable of recognizing it and then rectifying it by eating, even in spite of the decrease in appetite. And you can be kind to yourself as you do this. It's not just about forcing yourself to eat even though you don't want to. It's about trying to help yourself find ways that make it easier, trying to find foods that are easier to get down. I mean, some things that helped me, which are pretty common tips that you can find online, is to eat smaller meals more frequently so that you're not trying to force yourself to eat a really large quantity of food when you don't feel like it. Also, what helps is to try to drink some of your calories, like in the form of smoothies or protein drinks, because that can be easier to get down when you don't have an appetite. Another tip is to make it as easy as possible as far as your food, so you may not feel like cooking, especially if you're very stressed out, if you're very emotional. So it may involve eating more convenience foods than you normally have, and that's okay. It's about dropping the perfectionism around that and realizing, hey, I need the calories, and it's okay if those calories aren't ideal foods. Another tip is setting a timer for, let's say, every 2 hours and committing to eat anytime that timer goes off. Another option is to carry snacks with you, because sometimes even when we do have a decrease in our appetite, it will suddenly come back or suddenly appear, and you want to be able to have food at that time. A point I want to make here is that it's okay if eating does feel like a chore. I know that we talk a lot on the podcast about learning to enjoy food and learning to love food and find what foods work for your body. But if you're experiencing a really difficult emotional time and you're experiencing this decrease in appetite, you may not enjoy food much at all, and that's okay. Those of you who are regular listeners have likely heard Brain Over Binge coach Julie talk about eating foods that love you back. And this is a wonderful goal to aim for. And I want to explain how it relates to what I'm talking about, but I want to start by saying sometimes in life, like you're not going to feel like you love the food, and you're also not going to feel like it loves you back, even though I would argue that it still does love you back because it's giving you that life-giving nourishment and it's sustaining you. But it can be like having a partner or a child that you do love, but sometimes you just don't feel like dealing with them. And food can be the same way. Like you know you need it, you know you have to deal with it, you know you have to eat, but sometimes you just don't feel the love in that moment. Just like your partner or your child isn't always going to make you feel good, sometimes food doesn't either. And that doesn't mean something's wrong with the food, and it also doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. Assuming there are no food allergies, and these are foods that you can normally eat when you're not in that emotional state and these foods work for you, don't be surprised if during emotional times, they don't make you feel good and they don't give you energy. I think people can be too quick to sometimes blame the food and say, okay, I'm going to cut out this or cut out that because it's making me feel bad, when they could be feeling bad for a completely different reason that has nothing to do with food. If during this past month I would have cut out all the foods that made me feel bad, I probably would have nothing left to eat. I remember thinking this when my 4 kids were babies and toddlers, that I would hear advice like, eat foods that give you energy, and I would eat and just feel so tired. And I would think, oh gosh, is it the food? And then I remembered that I hadn't slept in 6 months and thought, okay, it's probably not the food. It's your stress level. It's your sleep. And yes, food is a factor, and you should always try to eat foods that work for you. But just know that there are other things going on in your life when you're eating, and it's not always the food. But getting back to the idea of the food loving you back, again, I would argue that during this time of emotional upheaval and during the sleep-deprived time when my kids were little, the food was loving me back. I needed that energy. I needed that nourishment. And even though you may not feel good, it's absolutely necessary. And as I teach on this podcast, if you're trying to recover from binge eating, eating adequately and nourishing yourself is an absolute must, even if you don't feel like it. Because if your appetite is suppressed for one reason or another and you don't eat enough, you're still putting your body in that survival state, and the appetite will come back. And if you haven't eaten enough, it will come back stronger. And if you have the binge eating habit, the urges to binge will come back stronger. So it's really important to remember that eating adequately applies even if you have a decrease in your appetite. It will definitely take more effort to eat adequately during these times. But I hope that some of the tips that I shared and just hearing about my own personal experience will motivate you to do that. Eating is much easier when your appetite is on your side, and this can go both ways. It's much easier to eat adequately when you have a sufficient appetite. And on the other hand, it's much easier to dismiss urges to binge or urges to emotionally eat or to overeat when your appetite is normal. But I think it's important to accept that sometimes our appetite is not on our side, and that's when we have to learn to rely on our higher brain and our more rational thought processes. We know basically what a normal amount of food is, so when our appetite is encouraging us to eat extreme amounts, we can step back and realize that we ultimately do have control despite this extreme appetite. And when our appetite is low for one reason or another, again, we can connect with our higher brain and realize, hey, I need some food here, and eat in spite of not wanting to eat. You can think of it as just doing your best to keep yourself on that middle ground with eating. You can do your best to eat enough even when you really don't want to. You can do your best to avoid extreme overeating and binge eating, even if that's all you feel like you want to do. It's about connecting to your inner wisdom when it comes to food and not always just following your appetite when it's misguided. And in this episode, I've focused on appetite changes due to emotions or stress. And of course, there are other reasons for appetite changes, and it can be extremely important to see a doctor or seek other professional help. And in saying that, I think it's also important to point out that a doctor would never say the solution to your decrease in appetite is to not eat. A doctor would also not say the solution to your extreme appetite is to overeat in ways that hurt you. But there can be physiological and hormonal issues that can create appetite fluctuations that may warrant medical attention. It's always important to take care of yourself physically, to take care of yourself mentally and emotionally. But what I really try to encourage you on this podcast is that taking care of yourself also involves dismissing urges to do harmful things, like undereat or binge eat. And I hope this episode will help you do that. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found it helpful in some way. If you need additional help as you use this approach, I've included all of the Brain Over Binge resources in the show description. You'll find my books, my online course, and one-on-one coaching and group coaching. If you're listening at the time this episode is released and you join the Brain Over Binge group, you can connect with me on a Q&A call this Thursday, May 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I do monthly Q&A calls with the group, which is in addition to the highly supportive weekly group calls with Coach Julie. And Coach Julie also provides daily coaching and inspiration on the group's forum. You can learn more and sign up at brainoverbinge.com/group. As you navigate your eating and any emotional challenges that you're dealing with, I want to encourage you and remind you that you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the hosts of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey. Need more help? You can find all of our current and upcoming options for support at brainoverbinge.com.